students. So topic for today's session is liver function tests. So these are one of the most widely performed tests in any clinical laboratory. So that is why we need to discuss about them in depth. So the learning objectives for this session are going to be that at the end of this session, the students should be able to describe the functions of liver, classify various liver function tests, describe the various liver function tests done in clinical practice to assess for the functions of liver, and to discuss the significance of doing these LFTs. So let us first describe the various functions of liver. It's very important for us to first know what are the various functions performed by the liver. Only then shall we be able to understand what will happen once these functions get deranged. So, as we all know, liver is the central metabolic organ, and it is performing a variety of functions, which includes excretory functions, like it is responsible for excretion of endogenous substances like bilirubin and bile acids. Then it has synthetic functions. It is involved in synthesis of various proteins. Albumin is exclusively synthesized in liver. Alpha, beta globulins, phospholipids, cholesterol esters, lipoproteins, they do get synthesized in the liver. Then it is also responsible for synthesis of various hormonal factors and growth factors. So coming on to the metabolic functions, it is the central metabolic organ which is involved in metabolism of carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, virtually almost all pathways. Now, coming on to the carbohydrate metabolism, we are aware that it is glycolysis takes place over here, followed by TCA cycle, ETC, oxidative phosphorylation leading to energy generation. Then there is glycogen synthesis, and carbohydrates get stored in the liver in the form of glycogen. Then it is involved in gluconeogenesis, conversion of one type of sugars to the others. Coming on to the lipid metabolism, it is involved in synthesis of lipoproteins like VLDLs, through which all the endogenously synthesized triglycerides are transported to various peripheral organs. Then beta oxidation of free fatty acid which have been uptaken from the plasma takes place, and it forms acetyl-CoA, which in turn can further go into various cycles like TCA cycle. It can go into fatty acid synthesis, ketone body synthesis, and cholesterol synthesis. So please remember here only that liver is the only organ which is synthesizing ketone bodies in the human bodies. Then coming on to the protein metabolism, again, the proteins not only get synthesized, they get degraded, and amino acids getting converted into ammonia, and then ammonia is coming into the liver and is forming urea. So then the detoxification, of course, liver is important for detoxification of various exogenous compounds like drugs and dyes, and endogenous compounds like ammonia and bilirubin. So with these all these functions now point towards the metabolic significance of this organ. Now when these functions get deranged, so what do they lead to? I mean, what kind of symptoms the patient gets? The patient presents with jaundice, ascites, and portal hypertension. I mean, not all patients are going to be presenting with these, but these are the most common symptoms of a liver disease. Jaundice, we already know, is yellow discoloration and hyperbilirubinemia is there. Then ascites is increased fluid in the peritoneal cavity, and portal hypertension is the increased pressure in the portal circulation. Then coming on to what are the clinical conditions? I mean, what kind of diseases that, or the conditions in which you are going to be prescribing various LFTs. So it could be, as we have discussed, jaundice, or whenever the patient is suspected of having gallstones, cholecystitis, then we need to see the liver functions. Then alcoholic liver disease, the name only suggests alcoholism affecting liver, and so we need to see the functioning of the liver. Then suspected liver metastasis. I mean, there are so many malignancies in various organs of the body in which metastasis is occurring in the liver and deranging the liver function. Then coagulation disorders. Why? Because all the coagulation factors are synthesized in liver. Then any undiagnosed chronic illness. Again, LFTs are ordered. And then monitoring drug-induced hepatotoxicity. There are various drugs like INH, rifampicin, statins. They can cause hepatotoxicity. So whenever these drugs have to be given on a longer, for a longer duration, so again we need to look for the liver function tests. So let us now come to liver function tests. These are one of the most widely performed tests in any of the clinical biochemistry labs. And since a number of tests can be performed to assess the functioning of liver, so let us first classify them so as to be able to, understand each and every test in depth. So one way of classifying these LFTs is to include the commonly performed tests in group 1. So they are also known as standard LFTs, which we will be discussing a little later. Then there could be second generation tests. So these are the tests to assess hepatic functional mass, that is the capacity of the liver to eliminate exogenous substances like amino antipyrin and endogenous substances like bile acids. So for this, serum bile acid estimation can be done. Then group 3 would involve non-biochemical tests like ultrasonography, CT scan, ERCP, cholangiography or liver biopsy. Although they are not from a biochemistry lab, but nevertheless they are very important in today's practice of medicine. So another way of classifying these liver function tests is based on the various functions performed by the liver. So based on this, group 1 tests would be tests of hepatic excretory function. So as we have already understood that liver is involved in excretion of bilirubin, so this group of tests is based on bilirubin metabolism. So now let us discuss these first in detail. So what are the various tests that are based on the bilirubin metabolism that are going to be performed in any lab? So they can be done on serum as well as urine. So the test performed on the serum. So firstly we estimate total bilirubin and then we estimate the conjugated bilirubin, and after deducting this conjugated from the total, we get unconjugated bilirubin fraction. Now before we understand the mechanisms or the principles of the test, let us again revise what are the normal serum total bilirubin levels. So total bilirubin levels are less than 1 milligrams per deciliter or 1 milligram per cent. This total bilirubin is comprised of two fractions, conjugated and unconjugated. So how much is the conjugated fraction? It is just 0.0 to 0.2 milligram per cent, and the unconjugated one is 0.2 to 0.8 milligram per cent. Now, why is it so? The reason is very simple. As we have already discussed, that after the bilirubin gets conjugated in the liver, it remains in the biliary channels. It doesn't come to the general circulation. It doesn't get to come to the general circulation. It is conjugated in the liver, goes into the intestine and then gets converted into urobilinogen. So whatever small, very small fraction comes into the circulation is also due to just the normal hepatic cell turnover. So it is the unconjugated fraction which is actually getting transported in the blood, and that is why the unconjugated fraction is much higher than the conjugated one. Now let us see how do we estimate this serum bilirubin. Again, you must have done this exercise in your practicals. So this estimation is based on Vandenberg's reaction. Now what happens in this is diazotized sulfonilic acid reacts with bilirubin to form a purple color compound azobilirubin, which is then measured spectrophometrically, right? So that is the principle. Then how do we interpret this test? It has three phases. First, the direct phase. Direct phase is that the moment reagent is put into the serum, within 30 seconds color formation is there. So that is known as direct positive. Vandenberg direct positive. And of bilirubin will be giving this positive? Obviously, the one which is water soluble. So that is the conjugated one. And this conjugated fraction is more in the serum in cases of obstructive jaundice. Then second is indirect positive. Now indirect positive, what do we mean by this? That in case serum had large quantities of unconjugated bilirubin. Now this unconjugated bilirubin is water insoluble. So it is not going to get reacted to the reagent and will not give any color. So however, when you use alcohols like methanol, which can dissolve this unconjugated fraction, then the bilirubin is able to react to sulfonilic reagent and forms azobilirubin. So that means that initially there was no color, but after adding alcohol, the color developed. So this is known as indirect positive. So obviously this is given by the unconjugated bilirubin, and unconjugated bilirubin is mainly found in the prehepatic or hemolytic jaundice. Then thirdly, the third thing is biphasic. Now what is this biphasic? When the serum sample contains both the conjugated as well as unconjugated bilirubin fractions, the conjugated one will immediately give color, right? But after you add methanol, the color intensifies. So that means something else has got added on. So that means now the unconjugated bilirubin is also giving the reaction. So this kind of reaction in which the color gets intensified after the addition of alcohol, so that both the types of bilirubins are estimated, is known as biphasic. So biphasic means both conjugated as well as unconjugated bilirubins are present, and this kind of scenario is mostly seen in hepatic jaundice, right? So direct positive, obstructive jaundice or post-hepatic jaundice. Indirect positive, hemolytic or prehepatic jaundice. Biphasic is hepatic jaundice. Now you must be wondering why we are discussing about these kinds of jaundice when we have not yet discussed about them. It is just for your preliminary knowledge, and don't worry, we will be discussing how to diagnose or how to differential diagnosis of a patient of jaundice, that we are going to be discussing in our subsequent sessions. Now from serum, let us move on to the urine, the tests that are performed in urine. Now this exercise is being done by all the phase 1 MBBS students, because it is a certifiable competency which all of you must know. So in urine, what you are doing for bile pigments, the test done is Fauche's, right? I will not go into the details of the procedures of the test or the principles, but what we are going to understand is in what kind of jaundice or what kind of bilirubin is going to give you this positive. So in urine, which bilirubin is going to be there? It is only the conjugated fraction. Obviously, because the conjugated bilirubin, being water soluble, gets filtered at the kidneys, so gets excreted into the urine. Whereas the unconjugated bilirubin, which is tagged with albumin, so obviously that's not going to get filtered at the level of kidneys, so will not come into urine. So when Fauche's is positive, again it is indicating that there is conjugated bilirubin in the urine. Then bile salts. The name of the test, I am sure everybody is aware, Hayes sulfur test. So again, we know the bile salts are synthesized in the liver and then they enter the biliary channels and then enter intestine and get excreted. However, if there is an obstruction to the flow of bile through any of these channels, so what will happen? There will be a retrograde flow, and with the retrograde flow, bile salts will enter the blood and now they will go into the kidney because they are water soluble and get filtered and come into the urine. So again, when bile salts are positive, so they indicate it is the presence is of conjugated bilirubin. Then urobilinogen. For this, the test done is Ehrlich's test. In this, deep cherry red color is formed because of the presence of urobilinogen. And I think if you remember my previous session, so we had discussed that urobilin, less than 4 milligrams is excreted in a day. So that is very, very small amount. So that is not a very conclusive test as such. But when urobilinogen levels increase, and when will they increase? More urobilinogen will be formed when more and more bilirubin is passing through the liver and intestinal channels. So this is going to happen in pre-hepatic jaundice or hemolytic jaundice, when large amount of bilirubin is coming to the liver. And mind it, liver has a functional capacity which it can enhance by 6 times its normal capacity. So what I mean to say is that even if the 6 times bilirubin load comes to liver, it is able to tackle it. So more bilirubin gets conjugated, more comes into the intestine, more gets converted into urobilinogen, which enters the enterohepatic circulation, and more comes out into the general circulation and into the urine. So this large amount of urobilinogen, which is characteristic of pre-hepatic or hemolytic jaundice, again will give Ehrlich's positive. So then group 2 tests are the tests based on synthetic functions of liver. Now in this we perform total protein, serum albumin, globulin estimations, and then calculate the AG ratio. Now these tests are basically the markers of chronicity. How? We will explain. Now how these total proteins are measured? They are done by pyruvate test. Serum albumin is estimated by dye binding methods, and then deducing this albumin from total proteins, we get globulins, and then we calculate the AG ratio. Now again, I have just named these tests. You will be performing these tests in your practical sessions, because again, this is the NMC's certifiable competency which each one of you has to learn and has to perform. Now coming on to the interpretations of these tests. Before that, let us see what are the normal total protein levels. So in serum, total protein levels are 6 to 8 grams %, and out of which serum albumin is 3.5 to 5 gram %. Please remember, I am not using milligram, it is in grams. And this AG ratio is 1.2 to 1.5 is to 1. That is, albumin is 1.2 to 1.5 times higher than the globulins. Now, what is the significance of albumin? As we have already discussed, albumin is the plasma protein which is exclusively synthesized in the liver. So, in a way, when we are estimating albumin, so it is reflecting the functional liver capacity. So how much liver is functioning? whether it is able to maintain the serum albumin levels or not. So another thing is about albumin is that, as I said, it is a measure of chronicity. Why? Because the albumin has a T half-life of 20 days. So any disease of acute origin, so will the albumin levels fall down? No, because the half-life is of 20 days. So obviously any disease which is of longer duration will only be reflected by hypoalbuminemia. So that is why we say it tells the functional mass of the liver capacity. Secondly, it tells us about the chronicity. And another thing important about the albumin is that it also reflects about the severity of the disease, because in patients with massive hypoalbuminemia because of massive liver cell function loss, even when parenteral albumin infusion is given and the patient doesn't show any recovery, so that shows poor prognosis. So that means it is also a marker for severity of the disease. So this thing you must remember, it is not going to fall in acute liver disease. It is a marker for chronicity, severity, and reflects the functioning of the liver. Then second test from synthetic functions that we perform is prothrombin time. Now, pre-prothrombin gets converted into prothrombin in the presence of pre-prothrombin gets converted into prothrombin in the presence of vitamin K in liver. So now, whenever there is a liver disease, so obviously the prothrombin levels are going to be decreased and prothrombin time is going to get increased. However, here we also need to understand that on one hand, it is going to be, the prothrombin time is going to be increased in liver diseases because of the inability of the hepatocytes to synthesize it. On the other hand, if we have obstructive jaundice, so obstructive jaundice, that means the fat soluble vitamins like vitamin K is not able to get absorbed from the intestines, basically because of lack of bile salts reaching the intestine. So what happens is that because of the deficiency of vitamin K, again prothrombin synthesis is compromised and leading to enhanced prothrombin time. So what is this prothrombin time? It is basically the time taken for the clotting to occur in citrated plasma, to which thromboplastin and calcium are added. So this prothrombin time normally is 10 to 16 seconds. Another way to express prothrombin time is by the way of INR. So what is INR? It is International Normalized Ratio and nothing else, but it is basically the prothrombin time of the patient divided by prothrombin time of an average normal person. And this ratio normally is from 0.8 to 1.1. So we have realized that prothrombin time gets increased in both the post-hepatic jaundice as well as the hepatic jaundice. So how do we differentiate between the two? Very simple. We give injection vitamin K, right? An intramuscular injection can be given. Now, if prothrombin time improves, so that means it reflects the post-hepatic or obstructive jaundice. It was only because of the vitamin K deficiency that problem was there. The problem was not with the hepatocytes. However, in case the prothrombin time still doesn't improve, so that means the problem lies with the hepatic cells. So it is hepatic jaundice. So if it improves, now prothrombin time improves, then it is obstructive jaundice. And in case the prothrombin time still doesn't improve, remains the same, then it is hepatic jaundice. And another fact is that prothrombin time increases only after almost 80% of the functional capacity of liver is exhausted. So now next group of tests are the liver enzymes, one of the again very important tests to differentiate between the liver cell injury and the cholestasis. Now we do understand that liver is made up of one hepatocytes and the others are the biliary channels. Now any disease affecting the hepatocytes will cause liver injury and is known as hepatic jaundice. The part of it's called hepatic jaundice or hepatocytic disease. However, any disease which is blocking the biliary channels, whether they are inside the liver or outside the liver. Inside the liver, if the blockage is there, it is known as intrahepatic cholestasis. And if the same obstruction is occurring outside the liver, say in the CBD because of some gallstone, then that is known as extrahepatic cholestasis. So, to differentiate between the hepatocellular damage and the cholestatic elements, we have these important markers as liver enzymes. So, in this, we include ALT, alanine transaminase, and AST, aspartate transaminase. These are again very commonly done enzymes for the liver dysfunction. ALT, AST, normal levels are around 10 to 40 international units per liter, and these both enzymes, they increase in various liver diseases and are markers of hepatocellular damage. So, moderate increase in these enzymes is seen, say, about up to 300 international units per liter. So, that is the moderate increase is seen in alcoholic hepatitis, and it could be seen in chronic hepatitis and autoimmune hepatitis. And then minor increases, say up to 100 international units per liter, are usually seen in chronic hepatitis and fatty liver. So, another thing that we need to understand, the relationship between these two enzymes is known as AST-ALT ratio, and this ratio is also known as D-Ritis ratio. Now, this D-Ritis ratio, normally it is 0.8, which means AST is lesser than ALT. However, whenever this ratio is more than 1, so which means AST component is more, AST levels are higher. So, this is a marker for alcoholic liver disease, and this D-Ritis ratio also increases in cases of primary hepatomas. So, overall, these both enzymes are used as hepatocellular disease markers, and they can be used for screening of the diseases. Say, for example, there is an outbreak of infectious hepatitis. So, even in the prodromal phase of the disease, these both enzymes will get raised, even when the jaundice has not yet appeared. So, they can be helpful in screening for the hepatitis. Then, as we have said, they can be used for prognosis, that higher the levels, more is the defect. And also, there is another thing, we need to understand that normally when we see the progress of a patient, so every third day, every second day, we keep getting the patient sample and we keep looking at the levels of these enzymes. And when there is a gradual fall in the levels, so that is a sign of recovery. So, we are happy that, oh, okay, the patient is recovering. However, if there is a sudden decrease, sudden fall, that is poor prognostic sign, very poor prognostic sign of liver disease. Then, so obviously for screening, for prognosis, for progress, monitoring of the patient and the severity of disease, these all factors we can get an idea by doing these enzymes. The next group of enzymes are the markers for cholestasis, and these are alkaline phosphatase and gamma glutamyl transpeptidase GGT. Now let us take them one by one. This ALP, the normal levels are 40 to 125 international units per liter, and this is raised in, as I told you, obstructive jaundice or cholestatic jaundice or post-hepatic jaundice. Now, when the levels are 10 to 12 times the upper reference limit. What is upper reference limit? We just said normally the levels are 40 to 125 international units per liter. So, when the levels are rising beyond 10 to 12 times the upper reference limit, this indicates extrahepatic jaundice. That is, the cholestasis or obstruction is outside the liver. And when the levels are about, say, 4 to 6 times the upper reference limit, then that is indicating towards the intrahepatic cholestasis. Now, intrahepatic cholestasis can occur in cases of viral hepatitis. So, viral hepatitis, which is an inflammatory disorder of liver, involves both the hepatocellular damage and also the cholestasis element is also there because of inflammation, swelling or ballooning of the hepatocytes, causing the small channels to get obstructed. So, intrahepatic cholestasis levels are increased, but not to that high extent. Then sometimes if you get, say, 20 to 25 times upper reference limit increase is seen, so in all likely they are coming from bone. The ALP is because of some bone disease. So what kind of diseases? Like, say, there could be an osteoblastoma, there could be Paget's disease or rickets. So then this is coming from bone. So that again now points our mind towards, it takes us to that means it has certain isoenzymes. Yes, it has 6 isoenzymes. One of them is in the liver that we have already discussed. Another one is coming from bone. Then there is another one which comes in the placenta, that is there in placenta. So obviously any pregnant female will again give high values of ALP. And there is another Regan isoenzyme which can be seen in about, say, 15% cases of carcinoma lung and all, it is raised. So the second enzyme is gamma glutamyl transpeptidase or GGT. Now the normal levels are, say, 5 to 50 international units per liter, and this is a marker for alcohol abuse. Means it is raised in whenever there is excessive intake of alcohol. So it's a marker of alcoholic liver disease. Also, the second purpose it serves is that this rise parallels with the rise of ALP. So when both ALP and GGT are increased, so then it implies that this ALP is of hepatic origin and not coming from the bone. So ALP, GGT, both when rise, so they indicates towards the obstructive liver disease. So the test that we have covered up till now, that is total bilirubin and direct bilirubin estimations, total protein, albumin, globulin and AG ratios, then prothrombin time and the various liver enzymes. So these all tests are included in the standard liver function tests. That is the tests which are commonly performed in any suspected case of liver disease. And now we come on to the next group of tests, and these are special tests. So obviously they are not performed in every liver disease patient, but they are ordered as and when required. So first of these tests is blood ammonia. So it is a test for metabolic liver disease. Now we know ammonia from all the periphery comes to the liver and gets detoxified by formation of urea. So ammonia gets converted into urea in liver. However, if there is a liver dysfunction, so obviously what will happen? Urea synthesis will decrease because of the decreased functioning of the hepatocytes, and the ammonia levels will increase in the blood, right? So what are the normal ammonia levels? Blood ammonia levels are 15 to 45 micrograms per deciliter. See, we do not always insist on too many reference ranges, but these levels are important for everybody to remember. So normal blood ammonia levels are 15 to 45 micrograms per deciliter. And ammonia is also generated by the action of bacteria in the gut on nitrogenous substances, and then this ammonia comes to the liver and gets detoxified. However, this detoxification function will be compromised in diseases like cirrhosis, when there is hepatocellular damage leading to fibrosis in the liver. Then there could be portocaval shunt. Again, the ammonia will not be detoxified, and collection of ammonia in the blood will, or the higher levels of ammonia in the blood, it will lead to something known as hyperammonemia stage. And there is a lactulose, it's a disaccharide consisting of galactose and fructose, is given to lower the blood ammonia levels. So we have, used our collateral knowledge of disaccharides in the form of lactulose, which is used for treatment of hyperammonemia. So then next test is alpha fetoprotein. Now this is a tumor marker which is present in the fetal life but disappears after a few weeks of birth. So obviously it is not normally present in the adults. So whenever its levels are detected in adults, so it points towards some malignancy. So there could be some hepatocellular carcinoma, or there could be a germ cell tumor. Similarly, in maternal serum, again alpha fetoproteins levels have a significance, because in maternal serum the increased levels imply an open neural tube defect in the fetus, and decreased levels are pointing towards Down's syndrome. So besides liver diseases, we should know their significance of this alpha fetoprotein. So next is ceruloplasmin. It's a copper containing protein which is synthesized in the liver, and what it does is it oxidizes ferrous into ferric, and thus is helpful in mobilizing the iron stores. The increased activity of ceruloplasmin is seen in cirrhosis or active hepatitis and hemochromatosis, whereas the decreased activity could be seen in nutritional deficiency of copper as well as Wilson's disease. Then the next is alpha-1 antitrypsin. Now this is an acute phase reactant, so obviously it increases whenever there is any kind of trauma or any infection is there, and decreased levels are seen in cirrhosis as well as lung emphysema. So next is serum electrophoresis. On serum electrophoresis, various plasma proteins get separated out. In cirrhosis, there is decrease in albumin levels, whereas increased alpha-2 globulins as well as the beta globulins, they indicate biliary cirrhosis or biliary obstructions. So after discussing these variety of tests, so we can understand that clinically our aim is to find out about the nature of the disease, whether the liver disease is hepatocellular or cholestatic in origin, whether it is mild or severe, or whether it is acute or chronic. So these battery of tests can help us in screening, in diagnosis, in making differential diagnosis, in finding out the prognosis, monitoring the progress of disease or the severity of disease. So I hope today's session has given you enough inputs about the jaundice, and now you are ready to make a diagnosis of a case of jaundice yourself. So we will see how we go about making a diagnosis or a differential diagnosis in a case of jaundice in our next session. Till then, happy learning. Thank you.